Shalom all, and welcome to our little course which I've entitled A Nature's View of Pirkei Avot. I'm of course your host, Ariel Tzadok. You find me online at KosherTorah.com. Now Pirkei Avot, you all know, is the wise sayings of the old Jewish sages. This book was pretty much put together in about the 3rd century, the Common Era, recording many older traditions going back a long way. But rather than turn this into an academic course, the likes of which we've already done and have online in our online KosherTorah store, MP3s, this is going to take us in a little different direction. Simply because I just want to deal with one little section at a time, and rather than analyze it academically, as I said, try to understand nature's ways. See, this is one of the major points that many people don't get when it comes to learning the Jewish sages. They think, most people today that is, think, that the Jewish sages of old are like the rabbis of today. They're philosophical, they're analytical, and in ancient times, they were not like that in the same way as people are today at all. The people in the olden days were much more what we would today call holistic. Almost, if you will, in a way, aborigine. They were close to the land. They were close to nature. They knew and understood what we can call the pulse of nature, the pulse of the world, the pulse of the people. And as such, these wise words of theirs reflects that. So rather than try to understand their words in a modern context, go back to the original, natural way, and to understand some pretty, what I think, cool insights that I hope and pray will help us reappreciate the Judaic tradition to be what it was always meant to be. In the words of Isaiah, light to the nations, or if you will, the true universal path. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about the religion of Judaism and the laws therein, but the wisdom of our Torah. That is something beyond even Judaism. And so, Pirkei Avot opens with these words. Moses received the Torah from Sinai. The Hebrew word is kebel, that he received it. And then the verbal usage changes. And it didn't say, and then Joshua received it from him, but rather it says that Moses passed it on to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. Now, needless to say, this mesorah, as it's called in Hebrew, this passage, is something that occurred over centuries. So what actually is the difference between, if you will, a passage and a reception? Well, the religion of Judaism very loudly proclaims that the entire Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Okay, that's what the religion states, but on a realistic level we know that that could not possibly be true. How could Moses go up to Mount Sinai, which is an episode recorded in the book of Exodus, I believe chapter 20, and receive the entire Torah? What about what was going to be in the rest of the book of Exodus, or Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Well, needless to say, those books recorded events, future events that occurred after the Mount Sinai revelation. How then could Moses have received that? Now, of course, people who want to turn to fantasy and illusion want to make up all kinds of silly stories, which they huff and puff and say, that's our belief. Well, okay, people can believe whatever they want. But I said, let's get natural, which means to get real. Needless to say, what Moses received on Mount Sinai, we all know from the biblical account, was the 10 Commandments. And yet we are taught that within the 10 Commandments we find the entire Torah. Now, how is that possible? How is it that you have the entire Torah, and yet we don't have the entire Torah? That sounds contradictory. But in a quantum universe of parallel realities, that which is mutually exclusive and contradictory here isn't in the reality of a quantum universe. Listen to this. Now, for those of you who've been around KosherTorah for a while, you know I've shared this before. The Baal Shem Tov, famous founder of Hasidism, brought down an old understanding that in its original state, the Torah is the blueprints of the universe. It's the soul, the guide, the way, the flow, the force of existence. It's the underlying of everything. And as such, prior to events occurring here on earth in the forms that they did, the, in quote, letters of the Torah, remember that's just a symbolic usage, didn't formulate into the structure until the event occurred. Kind of like what we know in quantum physics, that the position of a particle is only certain under observation. But when it's not being observed, we really don't know where it's at. It's the same thing with the letters of the Torah. So you see, Moses received the entire revelation at Mount Sinai, but he received only a small portion of it in its finite form. The vast majority was in its quantum state. And he passed on what he had in its finite form to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders to the prophets of the men to the men of the great assembly. And yet, in this passage, there was, if you will, the link, like a long cord, like an electrical cord. You know, you're talking about an extension cord. Well, this extension cord goes back thousands of years in history. And it's through that extension cord that whenever Torah was going to arise in the minds of anyone, whether it be Joshua, the elders, the prophets, men of the great assembly, they were connected to the source. So you see, they did not receive the source. Only Moses did that. But because they're plugged in, they're connected. And because they're connected, they received. That is the whole passage here of this mesorah, this passing on. You see, when it wasn't here before, Moses, like the good old catcher, he received it. And then he passed it on. And in that passage comes the life of what we can call the living Torah. And it's in that living Torah that we find the great wisdom. The men of the great assembly said three things: be deliberating in judgment, raise up many students, make a fence around the Torah. Interesting that of all the wise words that could be said here at the beginning, these are the ones. And yet, it says here again that these three are like the pillars upon which reality stands. Now think about it. What does it mean to be deliberating? The Hebrew word is matun or matunim. It means take it easy, take it slow. When it comes time to making decisions, don't rush. Somebody pressures you and says, you got to make a decision right now. Well, there are times when to make a quick decision is right. But there are also times when to make a quick decision is very wrong. And we think about it in the greater in the greater scheme of things. So whenever you feel pressured to have to make a decision, sometimes patience, calmness. This is what's called being deliberating, where you just sit back, you take it easy, you don't be rushed, and you allow nature to take its course rather than you trying to direct the course of nature. This is the first words of the sages, the mesorah, the continuing tradition. Take it easy. Don't be in such a rush. Take it easy. First thing. And once you get that, what next? It says here, raise up many students. In other words, it's not just enough that you yourself get the message. Pass it on. Just like the mesorah, pass it on. And what do you pass on? Philosophy? Intellect? Things to memorize? No. Taking it easy. First things that the students need to learn is how to connect to the living connection. How to take things nice and slow. To appreciate the natural way. To experience it directly. And then, make a fence around the Torah. You see, our sages were very wise. Unlike in many other religions that always try to proclaim how righteous and holy their adherents are, our sages were honest. They recognized the true nature of human beings. They recognized that we are all frail and mortal. And they know that some people are good and some people are bad, and some people are honest and some people are dishonest. They recognized the duality, the flow in nature. And as such, they said, people need safeguards. One of the laws of the Torah says, in those days when they had flat roofs, that you had to build a fence around your roof. Why? Because obviously, if people are going up to your flat roof to enjoy the cool weather or whatever, and they're going to say, "Oh, I can get close to the edge of the roof. I'm not going to fall off." Right. Well, we all know that. Protect yourselves and protect others. This is why the sages ordained what we call rabbinic laws. They were to protect us, to help us, steer us, guide us. Not unnaturally, but very naturally. And when one understands the true nature and wisdom of the ancient sages, one sees within them, in the pages of the Talmud, in the Mishnah, and in the Gemara, such subtle levels of what we call the prophetic, kabbalistic, experiential teachings. They knew. They were indeed connected. And that's why we learn these things. So that through their example, we can turn off the head, we can open the heart, and flow in the right way. That's nature's way in Pirkei Avot. I'm your host, Ariel Tzadok. Thanks for joining me. And I hope I'll see you in our next little mini class, when we'll continue these words of our sages. God bless. Shalom. Sages. God bless. Shalom.